Have you ever walked into a room where everyone speaks English, and suddenly you feel your confidence disappear? That was me on the day of my first parent-teacher meeting in an American school. I was nervous, curious, and honestly a little scared. But what happened inside that classroom surprised me in ways I never expected, and it slowly changed how I see learning English, family, and life in America. My first parent-teacher meeting in America. Walking into a room where everyone speaks English fluently can feel strangely intimidating, especially when you are still learning the language yourself. That was exactly how I felt on the day of my first parent-teacher meeting at an American school. My heart was beating faster than usual, my mind was full of questions, and honestly, I had no idea what to expect behind that classroom door. Yet that simple meeting would later become one of the most surprising and meaningful experiences of my life in the United States. The story begins on a calm afternoon in a small American town where my family and I had recently settled. From the outside, everything looked peaceful and ordinary. Parents were walking in and out of the school building, some chatting comfortably, others checking their phones while waiting for their turn to meet the teacher. If someone had looked at me at that moment, they might have thought I was just another parent attending a school meeting. But inside my mind, things were very different. My English was still slow. Not terrible, but far from confident. I could handle simple daily conversations. Ordering coffee, asking for directions, greeting coworkers, those things had become easier over time. But a parent-teacher meeting felt different. Conversations about education, behavior, or learning progress often include words and expressions that are not used in everyday small talk. And when the topic is your child, the pressure feels even bigger. Because you want to understand every single word. Something interesting happens in the human brain during moments like this. Psychologists explain that when people feel nervous, the brain automatically shifts into a protective mode. A small part of the brain called the amygdala becomes more active. Its main job is to detect danger and prepare the body to respond quickly. The problem is that the brain cannot always tell the difference between real danger and social stress. To the brain, speaking English in an unfamiliar situation can sometimes feel like standing in front of a crowd without preparation. So the body reacts. Your heart beats faster. Your breathing becomes slightly shallow. Your thoughts start racing. And suddenly, a simple sentence like "How is your child doing in class?" sounds much more complicated than it should. That afternoon, I parked my car outside the school and stayed inside for a few quiet seconds. The building looked warm and welcoming. Children's drawings decorated the windows. A few parents walked by, talking casually in English as if it were the easiest thing in the world. They looked relaxed. I felt cautious. I opened the email from the school again on my phone just to double-check the information. Parent-teacher conference, room 204. Clear. Simple. Still, my mind kept imagining different situations. What if the teacher spoke too fast? What if I misunderstood something important about my child? What if she asked me a question and I could not answer clearly? These thoughts might sound familiar to anyone who has tried to adapt to life in a new country. Language is not only about vocabulary or grammar rules. Language is deeply connected to confidence. And confidence usually grows slowly, step by step, through small experiences. When my family first arrived in the United States, nearly everything felt unfamiliar. The weather patterns were different. The food tasted slightly different. Even everyday communication felt different. People smiled more often when greeting strangers. Cashiers sometimes asked, "How's your day going?" Neighbors waved even if they had never met you before. These small cultural details may seem simple, but when you are new to a country, they can feel surprisingly overwhelming. At work, I listened carefully to every conversation around me. Some days I understood almost everything. Other days I caught only half of what people were saying. And occasionally my brain simply needed time to process what it had heard. Language learning in real life does not happen like it does in textbooks. In textbooks, sentences are clear and slow. In real life, people speak naturally and sometimes very quickly. But something fascinating happens when you live in an English-speaking environment long enough. Your brain gradually begins recognizing patterns. Common phrases. The rhythm of speech. The natural flow of conversations. Researchers who study language learning often describe this process as language immersion. According to studies from institutions like MIT and Stanford, the brain adapts more effectively when language learning is connected to real experiences and emotional situations. Stories, conversations, and personal moments activate multiple areas of the brain at once. That means learning becomes more natural. And that afternoon at the school, I was about to experience one of those real moments. Finally, I stepped out of the car. The air felt cool, and the late afternoon sun cast a soft golden light across the school parking lot. Parents were walking toward the entrance, some holding notebooks, others holding the hands of younger children. One father passed by and gave a friendly smile. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," I replied. Two simple sentences. Just a few seconds. Yet these small exchanges are exactly how confidence slowly grows when learning a new language. Inside the school building, the hallway smelled faintly of paper, crayons, and cleaning spray, the classic scent of an elementary school. Bright posters covered the walls, each one carrying encouraging messages for students. One poster read, "Every child can learn." Another said, "Mistakes help us grow." I paused for a moment when I read that second message. Mistakes help us grow. It sounds like a sentence designed for children. But for adults learning English, it might be even more important. Many adults are afraid of making mistakes when speaking a new language. They worry about grammar. They worry about pronunciation. They worry about sounding awkward. Children approach language very differently. They speak first. They make mistakes. Then they learn. That simple difference is one reason children often learn languages faster than adults. Standing there in the hallway, another thought suddenly crossed my mind. My child was probably more comfortable in this school than I was. He spent hours there every day, learning, playing, speaking English naturally with friends. Meanwhile, I was the one feeling nervous about a simple meeting. Life can be funny like that. Slowly, I walked down the hallway, reading the numbers on each classroom door. 200, 201, 202. With every step, my heartbeat felt a little stronger. Then I saw it. Room 204. The door was slightly open, and soft voices could be heard from inside. Parents and a teacher were already talking together. At that moment, I stopped for just 1 second and took a deep breath. Then I told myself something simple but powerful. This is not an exam. This is just a conversation. Sometimes the most important step in learning English, or adapting to life in a new country, is not learning new vocabulary. It is simply finding the courage to open a door. So I reached forward and gently pushed the classroom door open. And what I discovered inside that room would completely change the way I understood American schools and my own journey with English. A life that started from zero. A parent-teacher meeting might sound like a small event in the life of a family. Just a short conversation with a teacher about grades, behavior, and school activities. But for someone who moved to a new country, moments like this carry a deeper meaning. They remind you of how far you have traveled, not only across oceans, but through challenges, uncertainty, and quiet determination. Standing in that hallway of the American school, waiting outside room 204, my mind suddenly drifted back to the first days when my life in the United States truly began. Back then, everything felt like starting from zero. New country. New language. New rules. New expectations. Even simple tasks sometimes felt surprisingly complicated. Opening a bank account, understanding a rental contract, or speaking on the phone with a customer service representative could easily turn into a small adventure. When people imagine moving to America, they often picture exciting opportunities, tall buildings, bright city lights, and a life full of possibilities. And yes, those things exist. But what many people do not talk about are the quiet moments of confusion that happen in everyday life. The first time you try to understand a fast conversation between coworkers. The first time someone asks you a question and your brain needs 3 extra seconds to translate the meaning. The first time you realize that language is not only words, it is also culture. For example, during my first week at work in America, one coworker greeted me with a cheerful sentence. "Hey, how's it going?" Now, if you learned English from textbooks, you might think this is a serious question about your life. So naturally, your brain starts preparing a detailed answer. Well, today is going okay. This morning I woke up early and... But before you can finish your explanation, the other person is already walking away. Because in American culture, "How's it going?" is often just a friendly greeting. A social signal. Not necessarily a request for a full report about your day. Moments like that are funny in hindsight, but when you experience them for the first time, they can feel confusing. Language learning experts often explain that fluency is not only about vocabulary. It also includes understanding social context, the invisible rules of communication. And these invisible rules take time to learn. During the first months in the United States, I listened more than I spoke. At work, I carefully observed how people communicated with each other. I noticed how they used short phrases in casual conversations. Sounds good. No problem. Got it. These expressions appear everywhere in daily American English. They are simple, but they carry meaning beyond the literal words. Sounds good often means agreement. No problem expresses reassurance. Got it signals understanding. At first, these phrases felt strange to me. But slowly, they became familiar. Language researchers sometimes compare this process to building pathways in the brain. Each time you hear a phrase repeatedly in real situations, the brain strengthens the connection between sound, meaning, and context. Eventually, comprehension becomes automatic. But reaching that stage requires patience. And patience is not always easy. There were evenings when I came home from work feeling mentally exhausted. Not because the work itself was difficult, but because my brain had spent the entire day translating language. Listening. Processing. Interpreting. Psychologists call this cognitive load, the extra mental effort required when operating in a second language. Studies from the University of Chicago show that people using a non-native language often experience higher levels of mental fatigue during communication tasks. The brain simply works harder to process information. But something beautiful happens when you persist through that stage. Gradually, the brain adapts. Conversations become smoother. Responses become faster. Confidence grows quietly, almost without you noticing. My family played a huge role in that journey. When you build a life in a new country, family becomes your emotional anchor. After long days of work and language challenges, home becomes a safe space where mistakes are allowed and encouragement is always present. At dinner, we often talked about our experiences in English. Sometimes the conversations were simple. How was school today? Good. What did you learn? Math and reading. Other times we laughed about misunderstandings. My child would tell stories about classmates, playground games, and classroom activities. Listening to those stories became an unexpected way for me to improve my English. Children's language is often clear and direct. They describe events in simple sentences. They repeat words frequently. In a way, their storytelling became a natural language lesson. Researchers in education often emphasize that story-based learning helps the brain remember language more effectively. When information is connected to emotions or personal experiences, memory becomes stronger. That is why stories are powerful tools for language learners. They transform vocabulary into meaning. They turn grammar into real communication. And slowly, they make a foreign language feel less foreign. But even with all this progress, moments of doubt still appeared from time to time. One of those moments was happening right now, as I stood outside room 204. Because the parent-teacher meeting represented something important. It was not just about understanding English. It was about understanding my child's life in this new country. How was he adapting? Was he happy at school? Was he learning well? These questions matter to every parent. And when those answers come in a second language, the responsibility feels even greater. I looked down at the small paper in my hand again. Parent-teacher conference, room 204. A simple sentence. Yet behind that sentence was a story of immigration, effort, family, and hope. A few months earlier, I might have avoided a conversation like this out of fear. But something had changed. Living in America had already taught me one important lesson. Growth rarely happens in comfortable situations. Growth happens when you step into unfamiliar rooms. Even if your English is not perfect. Even if your confidence is still developing. Even if your heart beats a little faster than usual. Because every conversation is practice. Every interaction is learning. And sometimes the moments we worry about the most become the experiences that teach us the most. I took another slow breath and looked at the classroom door again. The voices inside continued, friendly, relaxed, welcoming. This was not a formal interview. This was simply a teacher and parents talking about their children. Still, what I was about to discover inside that room would reveal something surprising about American schools, and about how children learn in this country. And honestly, I was not expecting it at all. Walking into an American school. The door to room 204 was slightly open, and warm light from the classroom spilled gently into the hallway. Voices floated out, soft, friendly, and relaxed. Not the serious tone I expected from a formal school meeting. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening. Something about the atmosphere already felt different from what I had imagined. In many places around the world, meetings between teachers and parents can feel formal and even a little tense. Parents sit politely, teachers speak, and everyone tries to appear serious. But the sound coming from inside this classroom felt casual. Almost like a friendly conversation. I slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that surprised me was the layout of the room. It did not look like a traditional meeting space at all. Instead of parents sitting in rows facing a teacher, there were small desks, colorful learning stations, and children's artwork covering the walls. Bright drawings of animals. Short English sentences written by students. Math charts. Science posters. And near the windows, a reading corner filled with small chairs and books. The room felt alive. Education researchers often say that classroom environments influence how students feel about learning. When spaces are colorful, creative, and welcoming, children become more curious and engaged. Many American schools design classrooms intentionally to create this feeling. Looking around the room, I could immediately understand why children might enjoy being there. Near the teacher's desk, a few parents were already talking with the teacher. They were smiling, nodding, and occasionally laughing. The teacher herself looked relaxed and approachable. She was standing rather than sitting behind a desk, which somehow made the conversation feel more equal. That small detail caught my attention. In some cultures, authority figures often sit behind desks during meetings. The desk becomes a symbol of hierarchy. But here, the teacher stood beside the parents, talking face to face. It felt more like a partnership. Another surprising detail appeared almost immediately. The teacher greeted every parent with the same warm energy. "Hi. Thank you for coming. I'm so glad you're here. Let's talk about how your child is doing." The tone was encouraging, not critical. And that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Educational psychologists in the United States often emphasize something called positive communication between teachers and parents. Studies from Harvard's Graduate School of Education show that when teachers begin conversations with positive observations about a child, parents feel more comfortable and cooperative. Instead of focusing only on problems, the discussion becomes about growth and support. Watching these conversations unfold in front of me was fascinating. One mother was speaking with the teacher near the bookshelf. The teacher said something like, "Your daughter is very curious in class. She asks great questions." The mother smiled with clear relief. Then the teacher continued, "She's also improving a lot in reading." The conversation sounded encouraging rather than stressful. Meanwhile, another parent was discussing homework habits with the teacher near a small table. Their voices were calm and respectful. No one seemed nervous. No one seemed defensive. And suddenly I realized something interesting. The meeting did not feel like an evaluation. It felt like teamwork. That idea was new to me. In many education systems around the world, teachers are the authority and parents mostly listen. But in this classroom, it seemed that parents were expected to participate actively in their child's education. They asked questions. They shared observations from home. They discussed strategies with the teacher. This collaborative approach is common in many American schools. Educators believe that children succeed best when teachers and parents work together as partners. Research consistently supports this idea. Studies published in the Journal of Educational Psychology show that students perform better academically when parents remain actively involved in communication with teachers. Standing quietly near the door, I absorbed these observations like a student watching a fascinating lesson. And in a way, that is exactly what I was doing. Learning. Not only about the school system, but about the culture surrounding education in the United States. A few seconds later, the teacher noticed me. She smiled immediately and walked toward me. "Hi there," she said warmly. "You must be here for the conference." Her voice was clear and friendly, and she spoke at a natural but comfortable speed. My brain quickly processed the sentence. Good sign. "Yes," I replied carefully. "I'm here to talk about my child." "Wonderful," she said. "Thank you for coming today." Those simple words had a surprisingly calming effect. Thank you for coming. In that moment, I realized something important. The teacher was not judging my English. She was not evaluating my grammar or pronunciation. Her focus was entirely on the child. That realization reduced a huge amount of pressure. Language learners often feel anxious when speaking with native speakers. But research in applied linguistics shows that most native speakers are actually very supportive when they see someone making an effort to communicate. The fear often exists more in our own minds than in reality. The teacher gestured toward a small table near the side of the classroom. "Let's sit over here," she said. The table had 2 chairs and a few papers neatly arranged. On top of the papers, I could see my child's name. Just seeing that name made the moment suddenly feel very real. This conversation would be about my child's learning, behavior, and progress in school. The teacher sat down and looked at me with a friendly expression. "So," she began gently, "let's talk about how things are going." Her tone was calm, patient, and welcoming. At that moment, something interesting happened inside my mind. The nervous energy I had felt earlier slowly began to fade. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe normally again. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of other conversations around us. Children's drawings decorated the walls. Sunlight filtered through the windows. And for the first time since arriving at the school, I felt ready to participate. Because this was no longer just a meeting. It was the beginning of a conversation about my child's life in this new country. And the next few minutes would reveal something about American education that I truly did not expect. Something that would change how I viewed learning, not only for my child, but for myself as well. The first conversation with the teacher. Sitting across from the teacher at that small classroom table, I suddenly became very aware of the quiet sounds around me. Other parents were still having their conversations nearby. Pages were turning. Chairs moved softly on the floor. Somewhere in the room, a clock ticked steadily on the wall. But at that moment, my attention was focused on only one thing. The conversation that was about to begin. The teacher smiled kindly and looked at the paper in front of her. Then she looked up at me. "So," she said gently, "I'm really happy to talk with you today about your child." Her voice was calm and patient. She spoke clearly, not too fast, not too slow. For someone learning English, that kind of speech is a gift. Linguists often explain that clear pronunciation and natural pacing make comprehension much easier for second-language listeners. Our brains need a little extra time to process unfamiliar sounds, and when speakers communicate calmly, it helps the listener build understanding more easily. I nodded and listened carefully. "So far," the teacher continued, "your child has been doing very well in class." Those words reached my ears like a small wave of relief. Doing very well. For simple words. But to a parent living in a new country, they carry powerful meaning. The teacher continued speaking. "He's curious, he participates in class discussions, and he works well with other students." As she spoke, she pointed to a few papers on the table. One was a reading worksheet with colorful drawings. Another was a short writing assignment. "These are some examples of his recent work," she explained. I leaned forward slightly to look at the pages. Seeing my child's handwriting in English felt strangely emotional. Just a few years earlier, our life had been completely different. A different language. A different environment. Now here he was, writing sentences in English at school. Life can change faster than we expect. The teacher continued. "One thing I really appreciate about him is that he asks questions when he doesn't understand something." She smiled. "That's actually a very good learning habit." Her comment caught my attention. Many students around the world are taught to stay quiet in class unless the teacher calls on them. Asking too many questions can sometimes be seen as disruptive. But here, it seemed to be encouraged. Education research in the United States often highlights the importance of active participation in learning. Studies from Stanford University show that students who ask questions and interact during lessons tend to develop stronger critical thinking skills. In other words, curiosity is not just allowed. It is valued. The teacher continued explaining different aspects of the class. Reading progress. Group activities. Classroom behavior. I listened carefully to every sentence. Sometimes I understood immediately. Sometimes my brain needed a second to process. But something surprising was happening. I was understanding more than I expected. This is a common experience for language learners. When we prepare ourselves mentally for a conversation, our brain becomes more focused and attentive. Psychologists call this active listening mode. In this state, the brain works harder to interpret meaning from context, tone, and familiar vocabulary. Even if a few words are missed, the overall message becomes clear. The teacher looked at me again. "Do you have any questions so far?" she asked. That sentence always creates an interesting moment. Because the listener has to decide quickly. Speak or stay quiet. For many language learners, the safest option is silence. But silence also means missing an opportunity to communicate. At that moment, I remembered something I had read about language learning. Experts often say that speaking practice is essential, even when our sentences are not perfect. Fluency grows through use, not through perfection. So I decided to try. "Yes," I said slowly. "I want to ask about reading." The teacher nodded encouragingly. "Of course." I chose my words carefully. At home, sometimes he reads English books. But sometimes, he prefers easier stories. Is that okay? My sentence was simple. Not perfect. But clear enough. The teacher immediately understood. "Oh, that's completely normal," she said with a reassuring smile. "In fact, it's actually very good." She explained that children develop reading skills gradually. Easier books help build confidence, while slightly more challenging books expand vocabulary. The most important thing, she added, is that he enjoys reading. Enjoyment. That word stayed in my mind. In many education systems, reading is often treated like a requirement. Something students must do to achieve good grades. But here, the teacher emphasized enjoyment. Educational psychologists strongly support this approach. Research consistently shows that children who develop positive emotional connections with reading tend to read more frequently and improve faster over time. In other words, loving books matters more than finishing difficult ones. The teacher leaned slightly forward. "Does he like reading at home?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Sometimes before sleeping." She smiled again. "That's wonderful. Bedtime reading is one of the best habits children can develop." Our conversation continued for several minutes. Homework routines. Classroom participation. Friendships with classmates. And slowly, something unexpected happened inside my mind. The nervous feeling I had earlier was disappearing. Not because my English had suddenly become perfect, but because the conversation felt human, natural, supportive. The teacher was not speaking like a judge. She was speaking like someone who genuinely cared about helping a child learn. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. Language barriers still existed, of course, but they no longer felt like walls. They felt more like small bumps on the road, things that could be navigated with patience. The teacher then picked up another paper. "This," she said, "is something he wrote last week." She slid the page across the table toward me. I looked down. It was a short paragraph written in careful English sentences. And as I read those lines, I realized something remarkable. This meeting was not just about understanding a teacher's words. It was about witnessing a child growing in a new language, in a new country. And the next thing the teacher said would surprise me even more, because it revealed something about American schools that I had never expected. A cultural surprise in the meeting. The paper the teacher handed to me was simple. Just a short paragraph written by my child during a class activity. The handwriting was careful, the sentences were short, and a few words had small corrections written in red pen. At first glance, it looked like a normal school assignment. But as I read it more carefully, something caught my attention. The paragraph was not about grammar. It was not about vocabulary lists. It was about feelings. The assignment asked students to write about a moment when they felt proud of themselves. That surprised me. In many school systems, writing assignments usually focus on describing events, practicing sentence structures, or explaining facts. But here, the topic encouraged students to reflect on their emotions. The teacher noticed my curiosity. "We do a lot of reflective writing," she explained. "It helps students understand themselves and communicate their thoughts." Reflective writing. That idea felt new to me. Education researchers in the United States often emphasize something called social-emotional learning, sometimes shortened to SEL. It focuses on helping children understand their emotions, build confidence, and develop communication skills. Studies from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning show that students who participate in social-emotional learning programs often perform better academically and build stronger relationships with classmates and teachers. In other words, learning is not only about information. It is also about understanding yourself. The teacher pointed to one sentence in the paragraph. "This part is my favorite," she said. I looked at the line she was pointing to. The sentence read, "I felt proud when I helped my friend understand the math problem." For a moment, I simply stared at the words. Proud. Helped. Friend. Those three ideas revealed something meaningful. My child was not just learning English. He was learning how to support others. The teacher noticed my reaction. "One thing we really encourage here," she said, "is cooperation." She explained that students often work together on classroom activities. Instead of competing for the highest score, they frequently help each other understand difficult lessons. Research in educational psychology supports this method strongly. Cooperative learning environments help students build communication skills and develop empathy for others. When children explain ideas to their classmates, they reinforce their own understanding while strengthening social connections. Learning becomes a shared experience. I thought about my own school days many years ago. Classrooms were often quiet. Students listened. Teachers spoke. Helping another student during class could sometimes be considered distracting. But here, collaboration seemed to be part of the learning process. The teacher continued. We also focus a lot on encouraging students, she said. Encouragement. Another simple word with powerful meaning. She explained that teachers try to recognize effort, not only results. When a student struggles with a subject but continues trying, that persistence is acknowledged. Educational research supports this philosophy as well. Psychologist Carol Dweck from Stanford University introduced the concept of the growth mindset, the idea that intelligence and abilities can develop through effort and learning. When students believe their abilities can grow, they become more willing to face challenges. Failure becomes part of the learning journey rather than something to fear. Listening to the teacher describe these ideas felt surprisingly inspiring. Because in many ways, the same principle applies to language learning. When adults learn English, they often focus heavily on mistakes. Wrong grammar. Incorrect pronunciation. Forgotten vocabulary. These mistakes can feel embarrassing. But what if language learning worked better with a growth mindset? What if every conversation, even imperfect ones, was simply part of the learning process? At that moment, I realized something interesting. My child was experiencing an environment that encouraged curiosity, mistakes, and growth. And perhaps adults learning a new language could benefit from the same mindset. The teacher then flipped to another page in the folder. This is from a group activity, she explained. The page showed a simple science project about plants. Several students had worked together to observe how plants grow in different amounts of sunlight. My child's name appeared alongside 3 other students. They worked really well together, the teacher said. Each student contributed something different. That idea of contribution felt meaningful. In many workplaces and schools, collaboration is an essential skill. Learning how to communicate, listen, and solve problems together prepares children for real-world situations. Modern education research often highlights the importance of 21st century skills, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. These skills are considered just as important as traditional academic subjects. Looking around the classroom again, I began noticing details I had missed earlier. The reading corner with soft chairs encouraged students to relax while reading. The science station displayed small experiments students had completed. A wall titled Student Voices contained short reflections written by children about what they were learning. The entire room seemed designed to encourage expression, to encourage curiosity, to encourage participation. And suddenly, the parent-teacher meeting no longer felt like a formal evaluation. It felt like an invitation to understand how learning works in this environment. The teacher looked back at me. "Your child has adjusted very well," she said kindly. That's not always easy when families move to a new country. Her words carried quiet understanding. Moving to a new country changes many aspects of life, language, culture, routines, and social connections. Children often adapt quickly, but the transition still requires support. Hearing the teacher acknowledge that journey felt reassuring. Then she asked a question that surprised me slightly. How has the adjustment been for your family? For a moment, I paused. Most parent-teacher meetings focus strictly on the child. But this question expanded the conversation to include the whole family. And perhaps that was another cultural difference. Education here seemed to recognize that children's learning environments extend beyond the classroom. Family experiences matter. Home routines matter. Emotional well-being matters. I answered honestly. It was difficult at first, I said slowly. New language. New life. The teacher nodded with empathy. That's very understandable, she replied. Then she added something that stayed with me long after that meeting ended. But experiences like this help children become very adaptable and resilient. Resilient. A powerful word. It means the ability to recover from challenges and grow stronger through them. And in that moment, I realized something. Maybe this parent-teacher meeting was not just about understanding my child's progress. Maybe it was also about recognizing the strength our family had developed by starting a new life in a new country. But the most surprising moment of the entire meeting had not happened yet. Because soon, the teacher would ask a question that I had been quietly worrying about since the beginning of the conversation. And my answer to that question would require something simple, yet very important. The courage to speak. The question I was afraid to ask. The teacher's last word, resilient, lingered in my mind for a few quiet seconds. It sounded like more than just a compliment. It sounded like a recognition of the journey families go through when they move to a new country. Resilient. Strong enough to adapt. Strong enough to grow. Strong enough to continue even when things feel unfamiliar. While I was still thinking about that word, the teacher gently closed the folder with my child's work and looked at me again with a friendly expression. So, she said, before we finish, is there anything you've been wondering about? That question immediately activated a small debate inside my head. Because there was something I had been wondering about. Something I had been thinking about since the meeting started. But asking it out loud required courage. For language learners, questions can sometimes feel harder than answers. When you answer a question, you can respond briefly. But asking a question means forming the entire sentence yourself. Choosing the right words. The right structure. The right pronunciation. And of course, there is always the possibility of making a mistake. My brain quickly reviewed several possible sentences. Each one sounded slightly awkward. I hesitated. But then I remembered something important about communication. Most conversations are not perfect. Even native speakers sometimes search for words, pause, or rephrase sentences. Human communication is naturally imperfect. And research in language acquisition consistently shows that active participation accelerates learning. The more we speak, the more our brains adapt to the language. So I decided to try. I took a small breath and said slowly, "Yes. I have one question." The teacher nodded encouragingly. "Of course." I looked down for a moment, organizing my thoughts, then continued. "Sometimes I worry, because English is not our first language at home." I spoke carefully, one phrase at a time. "At school, he learns English every day. But at home, we also speak another language." I paused briefly, searching for the right word. "Is that confusing for him?" The teacher's reaction was immediate. She smiled warmly. "Oh, not at all," she said. Her answer came with such confidence that it instantly eased the tension in my shoulders. In fact, she continued, being bilingual can be a wonderful advantage for children. Advantage. That word caught my attention immediately. Many immigrant families worry that speaking multiple languages might slow a child's academic progress. But educational research often shows the opposite. Studies from universities such as UCLA and the University of Toronto have found that bilingual children frequently develop stronger cognitive flexibility. In simple terms, their brains become skilled at switching between different language systems. This mental flexibility can support problem-solving, creativity, and even memory. The teacher explained it in a very simple way. When children grow up hearing two languages, she said, their brains learn to recognize patterns more easily. She added that bilingual students sometimes take a little longer to build vocabulary in each individual language. But over time, they often develop broader communication skills overall. So speaking your home language with your child is actually very positive, she concluded. That answer surprised me. For months, I had quietly wondered whether using our native language at home might somehow slow my child's English development. But according to the teacher, maintaining both languages was beneficial. In fact, she encouraged it. Language is part of identity, she explained. When children stay connected to their family language, they stay connected to their culture and their roots. Roots. Another powerful word. Moving to a new country often requires building new branches in life, new jobs, new friendships, new routines. But roots still matter. They connect people to where they came from. They carry memories, traditions, and values. The teacher then shared something interesting from her own experience. Many of my students grow up speaking more than one language, she said. And they often bring wonderful perspectives into the classroom. She described how students sometimes share stories about family traditions, food, or holidays from different cultures. These moments allow classmates to learn about the world beyond their immediate environment. In a way, diversity becomes a learning resource. Listening to her explain this made me realize something. My child was not simply adapting to a new culture. He was also bringing something unique into that environment. A different background. A different perspective. A different story. And that combination of cultures might actually enrich his learning experience. The teacher then asked another thoughtful question. At home, do you read together sometimes? Yes, I replied. Sometimes before sleep. She nodded approvingly. That's excellent. reading at home plays a significant role in language development. According to research from the American Academy of Pediatrics, children who experience regular reading routines develop stronger vocabulary and comprehension skills. Even more interesting, the language used during reading does not always have to be English. Stories in any language support imagination, narrative understanding, and emotional connection with books. The teacher leaned slightly forward. What kind of stories does he enjoy? I thought for a moment. Adventure stories, I said. And funny books. She laughed softly. That sounds like many children. Then she added something that stayed with me. The most important thing is that he loves stories. When children love stories, learning becomes natural. Love stories. That phrase felt meaningful. Because stories do something powerful to the human brain. They organize information into meaningful sequences. They connect emotions with events. They transform language from isolated words into experiences. And perhaps that is why storytelling works so well for learning English. When we listen to a story, we are not just hearing vocabulary. We are following a journey. A journey of people, emotions, challenges, and growth. Just like the journey my family had taken by moving to the United States. The teacher glanced briefly at the clock on the wall. We still have a few minutes, she said. Is there anything else on your mind? There was, actually. One more question. A question I had been quietly carrying since the beginning of the meeting. A question that felt important not only as a parent, but also as someone still learning English in a new country. And asking it would reveal something surprising about how American schools think about the future of their students. My wife and our journey in America. The teacher's question, is there anything else on your mind? Hung gently in the air. I could have asked another question about school subjects or homework routines. But suddenly, my thoughts drifted somewhere else. They drifted back to the journey that had brought my family to this classroom in the first place. Because sitting in that small chair inside an American school was not just about education. It was also the result of many decisions, many sacrifices, and many quiet moments of determination shared between my wife and me. When people talk about immigration, they often focus on practical things, documents, jobs, housing, and logistics. But behind all of those practical steps lies something deeper. Partnership. Moving to a new country is rarely a journey someone takes alone. For families, it becomes a shared adventure filled with uncertainty and hope. In our case, my wife was often the calm voice when life felt overwhelming. During the early months in America, there were many small challenges that required patience. Simple tasks could take longer than expected. Understanding paperwork sometimes felt like decoding a puzzle written in a different language. And of course, there was English. Language learning can sometimes feel like climbing a hill that never quite ends. Some days the progress feels exciting. Other days it feels slow and frustrating. But my wife had a way of making the process lighter. When I came home from work and talked about struggling to understand a fast conversation, she would smile and say something simple. That's okay. Tomorrow you will understand a little more. Her confidence often felt stronger than mine. Psychologists sometimes describe this kind of support as emotional buffering. When one person in a relationship experiences stress, encouragement from a partner can reduce anxiety and restore motivation. In simple terms, support makes difficult journeys easier. One evening, not long after we arrived in the United States, we were sitting at the kitchen table discussing our new life. The apartment was quiet. Outside the window, the lights of the neighborhood glowed softly in the evening. We talked about many things. Work, school, bills. But one topic returned again and again. The future of our child. Like most parents, we wanted to create opportunities that might not have existed before. Education was one of the biggest reasons we chose to start a new chapter in another country. American schools are known for encouraging creativity, participation, and independent thinking. These qualities can open many doors for children as they grow. But opportunities alone are not enough. Children also need support, stability, and encouragement from home. And that responsibility belongs to parents. My wife understood that deeply. She often reminded me that learning English was not just something we were doing for ourselves. It was also a way to stay connected with our child's life in school. If we can understand his teachers, she once said, we can help him more. That sentence stayed with me. Language was not just a skill. It was a bridge. A bridge connecting home and school. A bridge connecting parents and teachers. A bridge connecting two cultures. And now, sitting inside this classroom during the parent-teacher meeting, I realized how important that bridge had become. The teacher had just finished explaining several aspects of my child's progress. I had asked questions. I had understood most of the conversation. Months earlier, that might not have been possible. Slowly, step by step, our family had built that bridge. And my wife had been one of the strongest builders. Even though she was not sitting at the table during this conversation, her influence was present in every word I spoke. Because confidence rarely appears suddenly. It grows through encouragement. Through practice. Through people who believe in you when you are still learning. Education researchers often emphasize that family involvement strongly influences student success. When parents show interest in their child's education, by attending school events, communicating with teachers, and supporting learning at home, children tend to perform better academically and emotionally. This idea is widely supported by studies from organizations like the National Education Association in the United States. But family involvement requires something important. Communication. And communication requires language. Not perfect language. Just enough language to connect. Thinking about this made me smile quietly. Because my journey with English had never been about becoming a perfect speaker. It had been about understanding people. Understanding teachers. Understanding the environment where my child was growing. The teacher noticed my expression. "You're smiling," she said kindly. "Yes," I replied. "I was just thinking about how far our family has come." She nodded with understanding. "That's a beautiful thing to recognize." She explained that many families in the school community had similar stories. Families who arrive from different parts of the world, bringing different languages and cultures with them. And yet, inside the school, their children were learning together, playing together, growing together. Schools like this often become small reflections of the wider world. Different backgrounds, different stories, but shared goals. The teacher then added something thoughtful. Children learn a lot from watching their parents adapt, she said. That idea felt powerful. Because children observe everything. They watch how adults respond to challenges. They notice when parents try new things, even when those things feel uncomfortable. When parents show persistence, children often develop the same attitude. In other words, learning English as an adult might also be teaching an invisible lesson. A lesson about courage. About growth. About never being too old to learn something new. At that moment, I realized that this parent-teacher meeting was not only about my child's education. It was also about our family's story. A story of moving across the world. Of building a life step by step. Of learning a language through real experiences. And of discovering that support, from a partner, from teachers, from a community, can transform uncertainty into confidence. The teacher glanced at the clock again. We still have a couple of minutes, she said. Then she looked at me thoughtfully. There's one more thing I'd like to share with you about your child. Her tone suggested something positive. Something meaningful. But I had no idea that what she was about to say would create one of the proudest moments I had experienced since moving to the United States. The moment I felt proud. The teacher's words, "There's one more thing I'd like to share with you," immediately caught my attention. Something in her tone sounded warm and thoughtful, almost like she was about to tell a story rather than simply give information. I leaned forward slightly in my chair. What is it? I asked. She opened the folder again and pulled out another sheet of paper. This one looked different from the others. Instead of a worksheet or writing assignment, it was a small note with several short comments written by the teacher. She turned the paper so I could read it. This is something I keep for myself during the school year, she explained. Just small observations about students in the classroom. Teachers often notice things that students themselves may not realize. Moments during group activities, interactions during recess, or simple behaviors that reveal personality and character. These notes help me remember how each student is growing, she said. Then she pointed to one particular sentence she had written about my child. He often helps other students when they feel confused. For a moment, I did not say anything. I simply read the sentence again. Helps other students. Those 3 words carried more meaning than I expected. The teacher continued. Last week we were doing a math activity in small groups. One student in the group was struggling with the problem. She smiled slightly as she described the scene. Before I could walk over to help, your child leaned over and quietly explained the steps. She paused. He didn't make a big show of it. He just helped. There was something deeply meaningful about that detail. He didn't make a big show of it. He just helped. That kind of behavior says a lot about a person. Educational psychologists often emphasize that empathy and cooperation are critical social skills developed during childhood. These qualities influence how children build friendships, solve conflicts, and contribute to communities later in life. In simple terms, academic success matters, but character matters too. The teacher looked at me again. That's something we really appreciate in the classroom. Hearing that made me feel a quiet sense of pride. Not the loud, dramatic pride that people sometimes imagine. It was more like a calm, warm feeling spreading slowly inside. Because for parents, moments like this are powerful. When children demonstrate kindness or responsibility in environments outside the home, it means those values are becoming part of who they are. The teacher continued speaking. Adjusting to a new country is not always easy for children, she said. Different language. Different school system. New classmates. She paused for a moment. But your child seems to be adapting very well. Adaptation. That word returned again. Earlier in the meeting, we had talked about resilience and learning. Now the conversation was highlighting something even deeper, the ability to connect with others in a new environment. Researchers in child development often say that belonging is one of the most important factors in a child's well-being. When students feel accepted and valued within their school community, they become more engaged and confident. Helping others is often a sign that a child feels comfortable enough to contribute. In other words, he was not just surviving in the new environment. He was participating in it. The teacher then added something unexpected. You know, she said thoughtfully, sometimes students who grow up in multicultural families develop strong empathy. I looked at her curiously. Why? I asked. Because they experience different perspectives, she explained. Children who grow up navigating multiple languages or cultures often become skilled observers. They learn to pay attention to tone, expressions, and subtle communication signals. These experiences can strengthen emotional awareness. In simple terms, they become good at understanding people. Listening to this explanation made me reflect on our family's journey again. Moving to a new country had certainly been challenging. Language barriers. Cultural adjustments. Moments of uncertainty. But perhaps those experiences had also created something valuable. Resilience. Perspective. Empathy. The teacher closed the folder again. I'm very happy to have him in my class, she said. Those words might seem simple, but they carry great meaning for a parent. Because every parent hopes their child will feel welcomed and supported at school. I thanked her sincerely. Thank you for telling me, I said. She nodded. I always like sharing positive moments with parents. It's important for families to know the good things happening in the classroom. Positive communication between teachers and parents has been shown to strengthen trust and cooperation. When parents hear encouraging feedback, they become more confident in supporting their child's learning journey. And confidence creates stronger partnerships. For a few seconds, we both sat quietly at the table. Around us, the room continued buzzing softly with other conversations. Parents asking questions. Teachers explaining projects. Papers rustling. The classroom felt alive with the sound of communication. Then the teacher asked one final question. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied. "What do you enjoy most about living here so far?" The question surprised me. I had expected the meeting to focus only on school matters. But her curiosity felt genuine. I thought about the answer carefully. "There are many things," I said slowly. "But one thing I appreciate is the way schools encourage students to think and ask questions." She smiled. "That's something we try very hard to do." Encouraging curiosity is one of the central ideas behind many modern educational philosophies. Instead of memorizing information passively, students are encouraged to explore ideas, ask questions, and discover knowledge through participation. That approach prepares students not just for tests, but for life. The teacher stood up gently, signaling that our conversation was coming to an end. "Thank you for coming today," she said. "I'm really glad we had the chance to talk." I stood as well. "Thank you," I replied. Walking out of that classroom a few moments later, I carried more than just information about my child's school progress. I carried a deeper understanding of the environment where he was learning. An environment that valued curiosity, cooperation, growth, and kindness. But the story of that evening was not finished yet. Because after leaving the classroom, something simple happened outside the school building, something that made me realize just how meaningful this entire experience had been. A quiet walk after the meeting. When I stepped out of room 204, the hallway felt a little quieter than before. A few parents were still waiting for their meetings, but many had already left. The late afternoon light coming through the windows had softened, turning slightly golden as the sun moved lower in the sky. For a moment, I simply stood there. The meeting had lasted only about 20 minutes, but it felt like something important had just happened. Not something dramatic, not something loud, just a quiet realization slowly settling in my mind. I walked down the hallway toward the school entrance. Past the posters. Past the classroom doors. Past the small reading corner I had noticed earlier. Everything looked the same as when I arrived. But my perspective felt different. Sometimes experiences do not change the environment around us. Instead, they change the way we see that environment. Outside the building, the cool evening air greeted me gently. A few parents were walking across the parking lot, talking with their children about the school day. Some kids were laughing. Others were explaining something excitedly to their parents. School had ended hours earlier, but the energy of learning still seemed present. My wife was waiting near the car. When she saw me walking toward her, she smiled. "How did it go?" she asked. That simple question contained curiosity, concern, and hope all at once. I paused for a second, thinking about how to answer. "It went very well," I said. She looked relieved immediately. "Really?" "Yes," I said, nodding. The teacher had many good things to say. We started walking slowly toward the car, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. The parking lot was calm, and the sky above was beginning to turn soft shades of orange and blue. As we walked, I told her about the conversation. About the reading assignments. About the group projects. About the teacher's notes describing how our child helped another student with a math problem. When I mentioned that part, my wife smiled proudly. "That sounds like him," she said. Parents often recognize small qualities in their children long before teachers notice them. But hearing those qualities confirmed by someone else, especially someone who sees your child in a different environment, creates a special feeling. It means those values are growing beyond the home. We reached the car but continued standing beside it for a moment. Then my wife asked something thoughtful. "Were you nervous?" I laughed quietly. "A little." She raised an eyebrow playfully. "Only a little?" "Okay," I admitted. "Maybe more than a little." We both laughed. Moments like this remind you that learning a new language is not only a technical challenge. It is also an emotional experience. Language connects us to people. And whenever we worry about speaking incorrectly, part of that worry comes from wanting to be understood. Psychologists sometimes describe this feeling as communication anxiety. It is very common among language learners, especially when speaking in important situations. But research also shows something encouraging. The more positive conversations people experience in a second language, the more their confidence grows. Each successful interaction becomes a small piece of evidence that communication is possible. That evening's parent-teacher meeting had become one of those positive experiences. As we drove home, the streets were calm. Neighborhood houses glowed with warm lights in their windows. Families were preparing dinner, walking dogs, or relaxing after the day's work. Life looked peaceful. After a few minutes of quiet driving, my wife spoke again. "You know," she said, "a year ago this meeting might have felt very different." She was right. A year earlier, my English listening skills were still developing. Conversations like the one I had just experienced might have felt overwhelming. But time changes things. Practice changes things. Exposure changes things. Language learning researchers often emphasize the importance of consistent exposure. Hearing English regularly in real-life situations gradually strengthens listening comprehension. The brain begins recognizing patterns automatically. Common phrases become familiar. Understanding becomes faster. Looking back, I realized that much of my English improvement had come from everyday life rather than formal study. Work conversations. Watching television. Reading simple articles. Talking with neighbors. And now, attending a parent-teacher meeting. Real situations create real learning. My wife looked out the window for a moment and then said something thoughtful. "I'm glad our child has teachers like that." "So am I," I replied. Teachers play an important role not only in education but also in shaping how children view learning. A supportive teacher can inspire curiosity, confidence, and motivation. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that students who feel supported by teachers are more likely to engage actively in class and develop positive attitudes toward learning. Support creates growth. Just like encouragement helps adults continue learning languages, encouragement helps children develop academically and emotionally. When we arrived home, the house was quiet. Our child was already inside, sitting at the table with a book open in front of him. "What are you reading?" I asked. "An adventure story," he said. I smiled. Adventure stories seemed appropriate. Because in many ways, our family life in America had become an adventure too. Not a dramatic adventure filled with danger, but a steady journey of adaptation, discovery, and learning. Later that night, after dinner and homework were finished, I found myself thinking again about the teacher's words. Resilient. Curious. Helpful. These qualities described my child, but they also described the journey our family had taken together. And as I reflected on that parent-teacher meeting, one final realization began forming in my mind. A realization about learning English. About parenting. And about the surprising lessons life can teach you in the most ordinary places. Sometimes, inside a small classroom. The moment I finally felt confident. Later that evening, after dinner dishes were washed and the house had grown quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the background, and from the living room I could hear the gentle sound of pages turning. My child was still reading his adventure book. Moments like that often bring a calm feeling after a busy day. But that night, my mind kept returning to the parent-teacher meeting at the school. Not because anything dramatic had happened. In fact, the entire conversation had been simple. Calm. Friendly. But that simplicity was exactly what made the experience meaningful. Earlier that afternoon, before walking into room 204, I had imagined the meeting would be difficult. I had prepared myself for complicated explanations, fast English, and moments of confusion. Instead, the conversation flowed naturally. Not perfectly, but naturally. And that difference revealed something important. Confidence does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly through experiences. Language researchers sometimes describe this stage of learning as functional fluency. It means a person may still make mistakes, may still search for words occasionally, but can successfully communicate in real situations. The goal of language learning is not perfection. The goal is connection. And that afternoon, inside a classroom in an American school, I had experienced exactly that. Connection. The teacher understood my questions. I understood her explanations. We talked about education, reading habits, and cultural experiences. At no point did the conversation feel impossible. That realization felt surprisingly powerful. Because for many adults learning English, there is a moment when they suddenly recognize something important. I can actually do this. Not perfectly, but effectively. Psychologists sometimes call this moment a confidence threshold. It is the point where a learner realizes that communication is possible, even without perfect language skills. Crossing that threshold changes everything. After that moment, language becomes less intimidating. Mistakes become less frightening. Conversations become opportunities rather than obstacles. Sitting at the kitchen table that evening, I realized I had quietly crossed that threshold. And the interesting part was how it happened. Not during a language class. Not while studying grammar rules. but during a real conversation about something meaningful, my child's education. Real-life context gives language purpose. When we care about the topic, our brains become more focused on understanding. Researchers studying language acquisition often highlight the role of emotional engagement in learning. When conversations involve topics that matter to us personally, the brain processes information more efficiently. Emotion strengthens attention. Attention strengthens memory. Memory strengthens learning. That simple parent-teacher meeting had activated all three. Emotion, because it involved my child. Attention, because I wanted to understand every detail. Learning, because the conversation required active listening and speaking. Meanwhile, in the living room, my child walked into the kitchen holding his book. "Look," he said, pointing to a page. "There's a new character in the story." I leaned over to see. The page showed a short paragraph describing an explorer entering a mysterious forest. "Interesting," I said. "What happens next?" "I don't know yet," he replied with excitement. "I'm going to keep reading." Watching him return to the couch with his book made me smile. Children approach language very differently from adults. They dive into stories. They guess meanings from context. They experiment with words without worrying too much about mistakes. In many ways, children treat language like an adventure. Adults, on the other hand, often treat language like a test. We analyze grammar. We worry about pronunciation. We hesitate before speaking. But perhaps the secret to learning a language is closer to the child's approach. Curiosity. Exploration. Practice through experience. Education experts often emphasize that language grows through use, not through perfection. The more we listen, the more our brains recognize patterns. The more we speak, the more comfortable communication becomes. The more we read, the larger our vocabulary grows. Progress happens gradually, almost invisibly. And then one day, a conversation happens, like the one I had at the school, and we realize how much progress has already occurred. Later that evening, my wife joined me at the table. "You're thinking about the meeting again," she said. I laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "A little," she replied with a smile. "So what are you thinking?" I considered the question carefully. "I think today was the first time I felt completely comfortable speaking English in a school situation." She nodded. "That's a big step." Yes, it was. But the interesting thing about milestones like this is that they rarely feel dramatic when they happen. They feel normal. And that normal feeling is actually the sign of progress. Because when communication becomes normal, language barriers begin to fade. The conversation at the school had not required perfect English. It only required willingness to participate. And that is something every language learner can develop. The evening continued quietly. Homework finished. Books closed. Lights dimmed. Yet one thought stayed with me as I prepared for sleep. That parent-teacher meeting had taught me something unexpected. Not only about American schools. Not only about my child's learning. But also about my own journey with English. Sometimes progress reveals itself in the most ordinary moments. A conversation. A question. A simple exchange of ideas. And the next morning, a new realization would appear, one that connected everything I had experienced during that meeting. A realization about learning, family, and the quiet power of perseverance. What that meeting really taught me. Morning light arrived gently the next day. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window and landed softly on the table where a few school papers were still lying from the night before. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that only exists before the day fully begins. Coffee steamed slowly in my cup as I looked at the calendar on the wall. Yesterday's parent-teacher meeting was already over. Life was moving forward like it always does. School schedules, work responsibilities, homework, dinner, bedtime, the familiar rhythm of family life in America. But something about that meeting stayed in my mind. Not the details about homework. Not the test scores. Not even the conversation itself. What stayed with me was a deeper realization about how life works when you move to a new country. Living in the United States had taught me many things over the years. Different weather. Different culture. Different communication styles. But the biggest lesson was something much simpler. Progress often happens quietly. Many immigrants, international workers, and language learners experience this feeling. At first, everything feels overwhelming. Every conversation requires effort. Every document feels complicated. Every simple activity, going to the bank, talking to a teacher, speaking with neighbors, can feel like a challenge. The brain works harder in a second language. Researchers at Stanford University have shown that processing a new language activates additional cognitive areas in the brain, especially during early learning stages. In simple terms, your brain is doing more work than usual. That is why learning English can sometimes feel exhausting. But here is the fascinating part. Over time, the brain adapts. Neural pathways strengthen. Words become familiar. Sentence patterns become automatic. The same situations that once felt stressful begin to feel normal. Yesterday's meeting was proof of that transformation. A few years ago, walking into that classroom might have made my heart race. I might have worried about understanding every word. I might have feared saying something incorrectly. But during the meeting, none of those fears controlled the moment. The conversation simply happened. That realization made me think about something the teacher had said earlier. She had described my child as resilient. Resilient. The word stayed in my mind. Resilience means the ability to adapt, recover, and continue moving forward even when situations are challenging. Children develop resilience through experiences. Through mistakes. Through encouragement. Through trying again after failure. But adults need resilience too. Especially when building a new life in a different country. Language learning requires resilience. Cultural adaptation requires resilience. Parenting in a new environment requires resilience. As I thought about these ideas, my child walked into the kitchen wearing his backpack. Ready for school? I asked. Yes, he said confidently. He grabbed an apple from the counter and sat down for a moment before leaving. "Did the teacher say anything interesting yesterday?" he asked casually. I smiled. "Yes," I said. "She said you are curious and helpful in class." His eyes brightened slightly. "Really?" "Yes." He nodded thoughtfully, as if storing that information somewhere important in his mind. Encouragement from teachers can shape a child's confidence in powerful ways. Studies from Harvard's Graduate School of Education show that positive teacher feedback significantly improves student motivation and long-term academic engagement. Words matter. Support matters. And sometimes a short conversation between parents and teachers can quietly strengthen a child's belief in themselves. A few minutes later we walked outside together toward the car. The morning air was fresh, and the neighborhood looked peaceful as usual. On the drive to school, my child looked out the window and suddenly asked a question. "Do you like living in America?" Children often ask simple questions that carry surprisingly deep meaning. I thought about the answer carefully. "Yes," I said. But it wasn't always easy in the beginning. He looked curious. "Why?" "Because learning a new language and culture takes time." He nodded slowly, thinking about that. Then he said something unexpected. "But you're good at English now." I laughed gently. "I'm still learning." And that statement was completely true. Language learning never really ends. Even native speakers continue expanding vocabulary, understanding new expressions, and adapting communication styles throughout life. Learning is a lifelong process. When we arrived at the school, children were already walking toward the entrance. Backpacks bouncing slightly with each step, voices filling the morning air with energy. My child opened the car door. "See you later," he said. "Have a great day," I replied. As he walked toward the building, I noticed something interesting. He entered the school with complete confidence. No hesitation. No fear. Just curiosity about the day ahead. Watching him reminded me of something powerful. Children often adapt faster than adults. Their brains are flexible. Their curiosity is strong. They treat new experiences as opportunities instead of obstacles. Perhaps that is another lesson we can learn from them. Approach life with curiosity. Approach language with curiosity. Approach challenges with curiosity. That parent-teacher meeting had started as a simple appointment on a calendar. But it ended up teaching me something much deeper. It reminded me that growth rarely announces itself loudly. Growth happens quietly. Through conversations. Through small successes. Through ordinary moments that slowly reshape our confidence. And sometimes, the most meaningful lessons appear in places we never expected. Like a small classroom in an American school. Yet the story of that meeting, and the surprising lesson it gave me, was not finished yet. Because one final reflection would appear later that evening, bringing everything together in a way that felt both simple and powerful. The lesson I will never forget. Evening arrived quietly again, the way peaceful evenings often do in suburban America. The sky slowly turned from pale blue to soft orange, and the neighborhood lights began appearing one by one along the street. Inside the house, the familiar rhythm of family life was unfolding. Dinner plates clinked softly in the kitchen. A backpack rested on the chair near the table. Homework papers were spread across the desk in the living room. Nothing about the evening looked unusual. But sometimes the most ordinary evenings carry the most meaningful reflections. After dinner, my child sat at the table finishing a short writing assignment from school. The topic was simple: write about something you learned this week. He held his pencil for a moment, thinking carefully. Then he began writing slowly. Watching him reminded me again of the parent-teacher meeting from the day before. A simple meeting that had quietly changed how I looked at many things. Not just school. Not just language. But the journey of building a life in a new country. When people imagine life in America, they often picture big moments. New jobs. Big cities. Major achievements. Dramatic changes. But the truth is often much quieter. Life is built through small moments. School meetings. Short conversations. Simple questions. Family dinners. Those moments may seem small at the time, but together they shape our experiences and our confidence. That parent-teacher meeting had lasted less than half an hour. Yet the lessons from it stayed with me for days. One of those lessons was about something many adults struggle with while learning English. Fear of making mistakes. Language experts often explain that fear is one of the biggest barriers in language learning. When learners worry too much about grammar or pronunciation, they hesitate to speak. Hesitation slows learning. But communication is not about perfection. Communication is about connection. During the meeting, I realized something simple but powerful. The teacher was not listening for perfect grammar. She was listening for meaning. She wanted to understand my thoughts about my child. She wanted to share her observations about his learning. And because both of us focused on communication instead of perfection, the conversation worked. That realization changed something in my mind. Many English learners imagine that native speakers expect flawless English. But in reality, most people simply appreciate clear effort and genuine communication. In fact, studies in applied linguistics show that communication success depends more on clarity and confidence than on perfect grammar. When people speak calmly and express ideas clearly, listeners naturally focus on meaning rather than mistakes. That is exactly what happened during the meeting. Another lesson appeared later that evening. My child finished his homework and walked over to show me what he had written. His short paragraph described something he learned that week. He had written about helping a classmate solve a math problem. The last sentence caught my attention. I learned that helping others can make school easier for everyone. I read the sentence again. It was simple. But it carried wisdom. Learning is not only about individual success. It is also about cooperation, kindness, and shared understanding. American schools often emphasize this idea. Students work in groups, discuss ideas together, and support one another during learning. Education researchers call this collaborative learning. When students interact and help each other, their understanding grows deeper and their confidence increases. But collaborative learning does not only exist inside classrooms. It also exists in families. Parents support children. Teachers support students. Communities support families. Everyone contributes to growth in different ways. Looking back, I realized that our journey in the United States had been shaped by many people like that teacher. People who offered patience. People who encouraged progress. People who valued communication more than perfection. Those small acts of support make a huge difference for families adapting to a new culture. Later that night, after my child went to bed, the house became quiet again. The same kitchen table. The same soft lighting. The same peaceful feeling from the night before. But this time my thoughts felt clearer. That parent-teacher meeting had surprised me in many ways. Not because of anything dramatic, but because it revealed something important about growth. Growth often hides inside ordinary experiences. A conversation in a classroom. A teacher's encouraging words. A child's homework assignment. Those moments quietly build confidence, connection, and understanding. Sometimes we expect life-changing lessons to arrive in big, dramatic events. But often they arrive quietly. In a small classroom. On a normal afternoon. During a simple conversation about a child's progress in school. And when I think about that meeting now, one final thought always comes to mind. Learning a language is not just about vocabulary. It is about courage. Courage to speak. Courage to listen. Courage to connect with people even when communication feels imperfect. Because every conversation, no matter how small, is a step forward. And sometimes, one simple meeting in an American school can remind you that progress is already happening, even when you don't notice it right away. That is the lesson I will never forget. A lesson about language. About family. About resilience. And about the quiet power of continuing to try. Before you leave this video, let me ask you something simple. What if learning English is not about memorizing thousands of words, but about living thousands of small moments? United States. A short conversation with a teacher. A quiet walk through a school hallway. A child proudly showing homework at the kitchen table. These ordinary moments slowly become your real English story. That first parent-teacher meeting in an American school was not just about grades. It became a reminder that progress often hides inside everyday life. Every conversation you listen to, every sentence you try to speak, every story you follow, your brain is quietly building confidence. That is why this channel exists. Here, you will not only practice slow English listening, reading, and speaking. You will also follow real-life stories about family, culture, love, and life in the United States, stories that make English feel natural, emotional, and easy to understand. And the most surprising part? Many of the stories you will hear on this channel begin with simple moments, just like that parent-teacher meeting. But the next story might surprise you even more. In the next video, I will share another real-life experience in America, one moment that completely changed how I understood American culture, communication, and family life. If you enjoy learning English through real stories, slow English practice, and meaningful life experiences, then you are in the right place. So before you go, like this video. Comment one sentence in English about your own learning journey. And subscribe to the channel for more slow English story listening practice, real life in America. Because sometimes the best way to learn English is simply to listen to a story and realize that one day, your story will sound just as confident.